There we go. God. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Blogging Theology. And this evening we have a very special guest, Adnan Rashid, who most of you will know as a historian, a Muslim historian, and a lecturer. Well, good evening to you, and you are most welcome, Adnan, to Blogging Theology.
Thank you so much for having me, Paul. My pleasure.
Excellent. One of the things we'll have to talk about this evening is what happened after the death of the Prophet himself, and particularly why did the Muslim army under the caliphs after him expand at such a rapid rate, both north and northeast and west? What happened, and what was the impetus or the motive behind that, do you think?
Okay, very good question. If I put my historian's hat on, then there are many, many causes I can give. And if I put on my Muslim hat, then the answer may be slightly different. So let's begin with my Muslim perspective. Yeah. My Muslim perspective as a believer who has studied history is that the companions of the Prophet did what they did after his death. Was due to the Quran. The Quran had stipulated that expansion in many different verses. Right. That expansion was simply looking at the Muslim perspective to make this world a better place. Okay. Firstly, we are told in chapter 21, verse 107 of the Quran, that the Prophet was sent as a mercy for the worlds. Right. Okay. So this notion was quite widely understood. It was basically, this mercy was to be applied to families, to environment, to geopolitics, to geography. Basically, this was a comprehensive mercy which was promised in the Quran by God, by Allah. So the companions understood this concept of mercy that is to be delivered in a very wide sense. So they had to do something about it. They had to go out and bring this mercy to humanity. And the only way they could do that was to remove the Byzantines and the Persians, immediate neighbors, to the Arabs. They had to remove them in order to bring this mercy to the people. So this was the Muslim perspective. We can go into details if you want. So the other reason in the Quran is basically to liberate the oppressed. Right. There is a verse in chapter 4 of the Quran whereby God commanded the believers, the Muslims, to intervene where necessary. If there are people oppressed and they are calling upon you to come and liberate them from oppression, you can call it Operation Enduring Freedom or liberation.
Term there from certain people, yes, in America.
Absolutely, absolutely. So this was Operation Enduring Freedom on the part of the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet. So they went out simply to liberate the masses of the Persian Empire and the Byzantine Empire from the oppression they were living under. So this was their perspective. In other words, to put it in simple terms, this was basically to make the world a better place through Islam, because the Muslim view was that Islam is the only way that can bring peace and justice to the world, which is much needed. And it was needed. If we look at the history of the time, I have written about it. There was a lot of suffering. There was a lot of devastation due to wars between the Persians and the Byzantines and all that. So there was a lot of suffering and oppression and heavy taxation and persecution, religious persecution in particular. When we look at the Syrian case, the Syrian masses were governed by the Byzantines, who happened to be Chalcedonians in their persuasion, religiously speaking. So they were actually persecuting the masses. And this was one of the reasons why the Syrian Christians, who were Orthodox Christians, sided with the Arabs, the Muslims, early Muslims, when they came into Syria, taking all that land. So this was one of the reasons why the expansion was so rapid and successful. So now if I put on my historian's hat, historians have looked into the causes. They usually look at socio-economic causes behind the great Arab expansion or the great Arab conquest. early Islamic conquest. They are called different things by different historians. Okay, this phenomenon. So they look at socioeconomic causes. The Arabs came out because they were poor, they were struggling economically, and the Persians and the Byzantines had much wealth. They were already exhausted by wars, and the Arabs saw the opportunity and they came out and they did it. Having said that, many historians are still not clear as to how the Arabs were simultaneously able to defeat two of the greatest empires around at the time, and why was their expansion so successful? Why was it not stopped or checked by either one of these empires? This question confuses, or actually, intrigues a lot of historians. To this day, they have, they have still not decided as to what caused the rapid expansion. The expansion did take place. They do try to explain it using a number of different methods and causes, but they still don't know, or they're not sure as to why it was so rapid. For example, Carol Hillenbrand is a historian. She has said much ink has been spilt on this phenomenon, but hardly any firm conclusions have been drawn as to why this expansion was so rapid and so successful, even though the Arabs were not equipped with any special weapons against these empires. Right. Similar things have been said by Lawrence I. Conrad, a historian of early Islam, and Andrew Louth, who has also written on early Islam. So many historians have expressed their astonishment as to the speed of this expansion.
So from a secular Western historian's point of view, ignoring the spiritual, the providential, the nature of what's happened, they're looking for material causes. And you had these two colossal superpowers that are striding, the world. And you had the Byzantines, who are the Christians, basically, in the what was now be the East, the Middle East. And then you had the Persian Empire, the Sasanians, who are, well, the Zoroastrians, I think, weren't they? Or
correct. Yes, Zoroastrians.
And these superpowers, of course, had been at war for some time, so they were weakened to some extent. But nevertheless, the Muslim army is like a hot knife through butter, going straight in, and with it, you touched on this briefly. This extraordinary point that there were many Christians under, say, the Byzantine rule who were heretics. Who were not, of the right Chalcedonian views about the nature of Jesus. This is all to do with, the person of Jesus. Was he one nature? Were they monophysites, or was he two natures in one person? The Chalcedonian thing, was he God? This is a really arcane, obscure theological debate. But nevertheless, whole peoples were persecuted over this. And so the Muslim armies went in, and how did they treat the Christians and the Jews as well? I want to touch on the Jews residing in those lands, because we have a view in the West, and it's almost common sense that, of course, the Muslims went in and they spread Islam with the sword, and they forced the Christians and the Jews to convert to Islam. And that's how, well, look at the Middle East today, look at Egypt, look at Syria, look at Jordan. These are Muslim countries. Everyone was forced to convert. But actually, there's a different story. The true story is quite different, isn't it, Adnan?
Absolutely. There are many historians who have actually expressed their opinions on the notion of Muslims advancing with the sword in one hand and the Quran in the other. They have almost unanimously rejected this notion, and they look at things in a more nuanced way. They don't believe that the Muslims were sweeping through these lands, converting people forcefully. So that has been rejected. This was a notion, this was an idea which was widely disseminated throughout the 19th century, even before that. I mean, the Arabs with the sword and the Quran, this was a widely accepted idea up to the 19th century. It was in the 19th century when some Orientalists and historians started to question it. And then later on in the 20th century, many historians completely rejected the idea. For example, A.S. Tritton was one of the people who actually questioned this idea. And then later on, scholars like Hugh Kennedy, who happens to be one of my supervisors at SOAS. Yeah, absolutely. He has written a book titled The Great Arab Conquest. he also rejected this idea that the Arabs advancing with the sword in one hand and the Quran in the other. This is a huge lie, which was repeated throughout the 19th century and was rejected, thankfully, in the 20th century. And also Michael Bonner is another scholar who has questioned this notion quite rightly. So this out of the way.
Can I just clarify? Sorry, just interrupt you there. I think that the reason why people may have thought that, understandably, actually, because when Christians, Christian missionaries and Christian armies and governments went to various parts of the world, South America, North America, Africa, of course, they did forcibly convert millions of people. And of course, Islam is just like Christianity, isn't it? You know, religions force people by the sword to convert. So maybe the idea was, well, the Muslims' armies went out, so therefore they must have done what the Christians had done for centuries in forcing everyone to convert. But of course, the reality is very different, actually, because is it not built into the almost like the DNA of the Quran, of Islam, that the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews, and by extension other groups, actually have a right in the Sharia to practice their faith and to self-govern to an extent as a matter of principle. So it's not just Muslims being generous, they are required by divine ordinance to treat people that way, in contradistinction to the historic Christian view. As I say, how the Christians treated Muslims when they in the Iberian Peninsula, and the Jews who were forced to convert to Christianity. So maybe that's why people just assume, well, we do it like that, the Muslims must have done it like that, perhaps.
Absolutely, absolutely. You're absolutely right. You're spot on, Paul, on that. And what may surprise you, Paul, is the fact that this notion of Arabian barbarity wasn't something that was invented in the 19th century. It is quite ancient. It is actually pre-Islamic. If you pick up some of the histories written by some of the church fathers, people like Eusebius, and to give you one particular example, Socrates, not Socrates, the philosopher, I'm talking about Socrates, who was a 4th century Christian historian. He talked about the Saracens. The word Saracen is ancient. It was used by the early church fathers, and they viewed the Ishmaelites or the Arabs as a bunch of barbarians who are semi-civilized, in some cases not civilized at all, and they were always invading other territories, and there were a bunch of robbers. So this is the impression that was put out to the Christian masses from the 4th century onwards, if not earlier. Then this particular impression or conception of the Arabs continued to be disseminated throughout Europe, because the Europeans, who happened to be Catholic in the early ages, in the early period, when Christianity did spread throughout Europe, they were studying these same works. The Christians in Europe were studying these same works, and these perceptions, they continued without being challenged. And then during the Crusades, of course, the Catholic monks who were writing repeatedly distorted history of Islam altogether, and to inspire the masses to, or even the barons and the leaders in Europe at the time, to inspire them to fight the Muslims for almost 2 centuries, if not more. They continued to paint the Muslims as a bunch of barbarians, violent people who convert people to their religion forcefully. And unfortunately, this idea or this way of seeing the Arabs and the Muslims continued as late as the 19th century. It was then when this notion was challenged and, of course, widely accepted in the 20th century and completely rejected by the 21st century, thankfully. Thank God. So this, you see, things don't come out of vacuum. Ideas don't just appear. They don't get acceptability in societies just because someone said something and people believe it. They have to be repeated. They have to be repeated. And this idea of Arab barbarity or forcefully converting people to their religion or Islam was repeated throughout centuries. I mean, of course, it reached its peak during the Crusades period, when Pope Urban II, the speech that is attributed to him, delivered in France, if the speech did take place, then even the Pope said things like that, that the Christians are being forcefully converted, they are being killed, they are being tortured, and the tomb of Christ is being desecrated. Therefore, we have to go and liberate the Holy Land. So this rhetoric and this narrative was widely spread, widely believed. Therefore, all the violence that was unleashed against the Muslim world was justified through views like this. So, of course, the reality is quite the opposite. Because when we study the history of Islam, of course, there were periods of disturbances. There were periods where Islamic law was not followed, and these are exceptional periods throughout the Muslim history. For example, I can give you the example of Almohads in the 12th century, when they took Spain from the Muravids, Almoravids or Almoravitun. They forced some people to accept Islam. Maimonides, the famous Jewish theologian, was one of them. And actually, you know, when you look at Maimonides' history, you come to realize he not only forcefully accepted Islam, he was forced into it. Later on, he renounced Islam in Egypt when he had moved to Egypt, and then he was put on trial for apostasy. And then the Muslim theologians came forward to rescue him and to defend him. They had argued in the court that Maimonides was forced into Islam, therefore his conversion was not valid. And if the conversion was not valid, his apostasy is not valid. He was never a Muslim. He was forced into Islam. So Maimonides was rescued by Muslims in Egypt, and he became the physician.
There is the Quranic verse, there is no compulsion in religion. So if that is violated, obviously it's invalid, that conversion. Well, what about sorry, come on.
These examples are very, very limited. There was a period of persecution in the 10th century when Mad Caliph al-Hakim, who was a Fatimid caliph, he had done similar things. So these are very, very, how can I put it, limited incidents in Islamic history. But if you look at the wider picture, from Al-Andalus, from Spain to China, where Muslims governed for a very, very long time, forced conversion is not found. It doesn't represent the history of Islam or Muslims. In fact, as you rightly pointed out, that there is a verse in the Quran, chapter 2, verse 256, that clearly states that converting people forcefully is absolutely, utterly forbidden. La ikraha fid din. There is no compulsion in religion, because truth stands clear from falsehood. Let people decide themselves. Let them see the Quran and let them see Islam. And if they want to convert, let them convert. If they don't want to convert, don't ever force them. This was the behavior throughout the Muslim history.
I've heard some people say, "Oh, well, this verse is just a very early Meccan verse when Muhammad was powerless." And of course, he'd say to people, "We're not going to force you." But when he became, the ruler of Medina, the caliph or whatever word, at that point, things changed. But of course, the facts are very different, because when was that verse revealed? Was it not in Medina, precisely after he had escaped to that city and was the ruler there? Then that verse was revealed, not in the early, but in the later era. Is that not the case?
Correct. If you look at the tafsir, the details, or the reasons for revelation for this particular verse, you come to realize that this verse was revealed about the Jewish people of Medina. Some Arabs had left their children with the Jewish people for them to be educated, and these children had accepted Judaism because they were inspired or influenced by the Jewish people of Medina. So these Arabs, when they accepted Islam, the Arabs of Medina, after the Prophet had arrived in Medina, they approached the Prophet asking him, "Shall we convert our children forcefully?" And the Prophet didn't give an answer straight away. This verse was revealed soon after as a response to their question. And the verse is very categorical, that leave them. If they convert to Islam willingly, then it is accepted. But you cannot force people to convert to Islam. So this is the context. This is the reason for revelation for this particular verse. So those people who argue that it is a Meccan idea, when Muslims were weak and when Muslims became powerful, their attitude changed. No, attitude did not change. Rather, if you look at later history of the Muslims, you will see that Muslims signed treaties with Christians they had already conquered. In some cases, with the Jewish people as well. Muslims had already conquered lands, and then treaties were signed. And these treaties basically offered freedom to Christians, freedom to worship, freedom to keep their places of worship, freedom to keep their bishops, freedom to keep their religion and their property. Nothing will change.
So Christians under Muslim rule can eat pork, they can drink alcohol, and they can have their customs and their religion under Muslim rule.
Not only that. The Muslims have to protect pig farms. If Christians are farming pigs and someone is disturbing them, or someone's threatening Christians for doing so, Muslim state has a responsibility by the law of Islam to protect pig farms. They would send Muslims to, I mean, ideally, I'm talking about an idealistic state, if it ever exists. Muslim state would have to, and if Christians are producing wine for themselves, not for selling to Muslims,
no.
Then even that wine factory, if they are producing, because they're paying jizya, they're paying a tax for their protection, for their well-being, and it's state's responsibility to protect their interest, to protect their religion, to protect their places of worship, and protect their honor and their property. So by that virtue.
Yeah, but this is a very good point, going into the question of what is jizya and how that relates to zakat, whatever that may be. And because in the West, of course, jizya is seen as a, I don't know, an unjust imposition of some terrible financial penalty for simply being Christian. I had this conversation an hour ago with a young guy, I would say who he is, but he's in a French school here. And that's what he understood jizya was, actually. It was a punishment for Christians and Jews, a financial penalty. That's what he said. Now, this guy is being taught in French schools as we speak, and he's got that idea in his head. Anyway, that's a different subject. But what is the truth about jizya? What's the real deal about it?
Jizya is a tax which the non-Muslims pay living within the domain of Islam. And Muslims also pay a tax, but it is not called jizya. It is called zakat, which is compulsory tax for the Muslims. Muslims must pay 2.5% of their savings to the state for the state to distribute that money among the poor. With regards to jizya, jizya is a fixed amount. It varies between 1 gold coin weighing 4 grams of gold to 4 gold coins. So a gold coin, looking at the Islamic history, would be called dinar. A dinar was about 4 grams of gold, which is in current value, it would be something like maybe 200 pounds, something like 200 pounds in current value. So a rich Jew or Christian or a Zoroastrian would pay about 200 pounds a year towards the state for basically, as a citizen, he would contribute that towards the state as a citizen. And in return, the state takes full responsibility for protecting his rights, for protecting his life, his family, as we have already highlighted. So the amount varies between 1 to 4 dinars. It cannot exceed that, Islamically speaking, although some rulers may have exceeded the amount. And this extra amount cannot be Islamic. It cannot be regarded Islamic, even by the scholars of Islam. So there is a limited amount. So the middle class Jews and Christians, they would pay something like 24 silver coins. And people who are doing hard labor, they would be paying 12 silver coins a year, which is like 12 pounds, equivalent to 12 pounds a year, right? So those people who claim that jizya was extortionate, jizya was astronomical, jizya broke backs of the non-Muslims, these are all, again, misconceptions spread throughout centuries, and they still survive, unfortunately. But if anyone was to study jizya carefully, idealistically speaking, Islamically speaking, jizya cannot exceed more than 4 gold coins per year for the rich. And that's where it is capped. It can, while Muslims, if there is a Muslim, for example, who has £1 million in his bank account, he would pay £25,000 on that, because that's 2.5%. But if a Jewish man has £1 million in his bank account, he would be paying 4 gold coins, which is like £800 a year. That's it. No one, Islamically, legally speaking, can ask him to pay extra, and the Jewish man can go to the Muslim court and complain if he's asked to give extra. And this has happened, Islamically speaking, in history. In fact, there is a famous case when people went to complain to scholars because of heavy taxation on the part of the Muslim rulers. This happened in Syria during the Mongol invasions, when Sultan Baybars had imposed heavy taxation on the Muslims and the non-Muslims to defend against the Mongols. Although he had valid reasons to raise taxation, Izz bin Abdus Salam was a scholar alive in Egypt at the time. He gave a fatwa to undo the decree of the ruler. So the rulers must abide by the law of Islam, and if they are breaking the law using power and influence, then they are doing wrong. Ideally, Islamic law doesn't allow more than what is stipulated in the law.
Okay. To the last discussion, if we may, is the Islamic conquest of what some people call the Iberian Peninsula, which is just a fancy way of talking about today, is Spain and Portugal. And I mean, I've heard, I don't know if it's true or not, that the invasion itself, the general who actually led the invasion, was not authorized to do so by the caliph in, I don't know if he's in Baghdad or Mecca, I can't remember. But nevertheless, he went in. Some people say that the Jews in the Iberian Peninsula helped the Muslims to enter into that land for their own reasons. But nevertheless, the civilization that grew out of that invasion in the coming centuries, an Islamic civilization with Jews and Christians, was one of the jewels of human history in terms of its culture, its literature, its philosophy, its in many ways, and it lasted many, many centuries until it was crushed by the Catholics, who then did various terrible things to the Jews and the Muslims. But coming back to that initial point, is it true that the initial invasion was not authorized by the caliph?
You see, generals at that time, when early Islamic conquest was still taking place during the Umayyad period, generals had, they were semi-autonomous. Right. They had certain discretions for them to decide. For example, if they wanted to invade a territory which appeared to be open to Muslims, or if the people were inviting the Muslims to come in and liberate them, like what happened in the case of the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal, then generals could do it without asking for permission. Right. But any major campaign, of course, any major campaign had to be sanctioned by the caliph. But in this case, what seems to have happened is that the Jewish people of Spain were heavily oppressed, and Jewish historians have testified to that. For example, one particular historian, Zion Zohar, who wrote a book titled History of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jewry. Sephardic Jews were Spanish Jews predominantly. Of course, they also lived in other parts of the Middle East and North Africa. But when we say Sephardic Jews, we are talking specifically of mainly Spanish Jewry.
And Portuguese as well, perhaps.
Portuguese as well, of course. When we say Spanish, we mean, of course, this is why scholars use the term Iberian Peninsula to include Portugal and possibly parts of southern France, and Spain, current day Spain, right? So the Jewish people were heavily oppressed. In fact, there was a council that took place in the year 633 CE in the city of Toledo. Spain by now, or the Iberian Peninsula by now, was Catholic, while previously it was Arian or Donatist. The Vandals and the Goths did not actually follow Catholicism. They were Unitarians in some form. And then later on, some kings converted to Catholicism. Visigothic kings later Visigothic kings rather, they converted to Catholicism, and Catholic Church took control of the Iberian Peninsula. And then many ecumenical councils were held, and in these councils, matters were discussed, important matters for the state and the church. So in 633, Fourth Council of Toledo was held. In this council, it was decreed that all the children of the Iberian Jews, Spanish Jews or Portuguese Jews, all the children are to be taken away by force, and they are to be converted to Catholicism and are to be raised as pious Christians by institutions in Spain or the Iberian Peninsula. So this is a year after the Prophet died. Prophet died in 632 CE. This council was held in 633 CE. What does this show you? This shows you that the Jewish people were heavily persecuted within the Iberian Peninsula. So when Tariq bin Ziyad, with his 5,000 Arabs and 7,000 Berbers from North Africa, landed at Gibraltar and later on mainland Iberian Peninsula or Spain, he was welcomed by the Jewish people. This is confirmed by Zion Zohar and many other Jewish historians, that the Jews welcomed the Muslims as liberators from Christian persecution. And this was one of the reasons why the Muslims were able to take so much land in such a short span of time. Within 4 years, the entire Iberian Peninsula, except some northwestern part of the peninsula called Asturias, where a movement, Reconquista, historically speaking, started, right? So northwestern part, some patches of the Iberian Peninsula were not conquered due to the terrain. The terrain was very difficult, but the rest of it was taken almost within 4 years. And why were they able to do it so rapidly, the Muslims? Because the people supported the invasion. And when some later Spanish writers claimed that the conquest was devastating, cities were burned to the ground and cities were pillaged, people were killed and murdered. A lot of these chronicles, in fact, there is an anonymous chronicle written in 754, almost 40 years after the conquest. This Christian author, anonymous Christian author, claimed all these things. But then later on in the 20th century and the 21st century, all modern works point to the opposite direction. They claim that archaeology tells us another story. When we look at the Muslim period, the cities started to flourish. They became bigger and bigger, larger and larger. The economic condition we see in archaeology improved drastically from looking at what was happening during the Visigothic period, just the period just before Islam, right? So many scholars have challenged, using archaeology, the notion of a devastating invasion of Spain. Of course, when there is war...
You could say that in a very real way, that Islam saved Jewry there in that part of the world. That if the Muslim army hadn't gone in, then the Jews, as practicing Jews, the faith of Judaism might have been obliterated in a kind of Christian Holocaust in a way, by taking the children away, forcing them to be educated by, I don't know, by monks or nuns or priests, indoctrinated into the Catholic faith. And so you talk about an invasion, but it reminds me of kind of the neocon language, Operation Freedom, which you mentioned at the beginning, invading Iraq, which really was an invasion. But from another point of view, it would have been seen as a liberation. For the Jews and others, it would have been a liberation. And the subsequent history of that country is extraordinary, isn't it, Adnan? The cultural renaissance, predating the European Renaissance, as if that was the first Renaissance, but there was a Renaissance in the Iberian Peninsula centuries before, of world historical significance. Can you say a bit about why that is such an important part of our world history, what happened in Spain and Portugal?
In fact, Jewish historians have repeatedly claimed that that was the golden age of the House of Israel. That was the Jewish golden age, in particular from the 10th to the 13th century. From the 10th to the 13th century, 950s to 1250s, this was the golden age of the Jewish people in Spain, particularly. And there's a reason for that. But before I get to that, I just want to very quickly highlight what happened after the conquest. After the conquest, there was a period of turmoil, political turmoil, because the Umayyads were removed from power. The Abbasids came to power. Cut the long story short, the Umayyads were able to establish a caliphate in Spain. And Abdul Rahman I was the first Umayyad caliph of Spain, independent caliph, independent from the Abbasids. Thenceforth, a civilization of a grand scale was created. Books were produced, libraries were established, streets were paved. Basically, cut the long story short, Cordoba became the most civilized and the most populated city in the world, with a population of 1 million people in the 10th century, when Abdul Rahman III was ruling. In the 10th century, in the mid-10th century, when the Umayyads were at their peak, the vizier or the prime minister was a Jewish man called Hasdai ibn Shaprut. This is why Jewish people regard that period as the golden age. This is the period during the Muslim period, at least the peak of the Umayyad Empire. Jewish people produced some of the best scholars, the best poets, the best thinkers, philosophers, you name it. The best Jewish literature ever produced was produced in Islamic Spain, in Al-Andalus, or in the Islamic Iberian Peninsula, when the Muslims were ruling. Muslims ruled parts of Spain from 711 to 1492.
Wow.
And yeah, almost 700 years. And for at least 300 years, Muslims dominated the political and military landscape of the Iberian Peninsula. And during this period, we had immense libraries created at great expense by caliphs, by book collectors, by scholars in Spain. Spain was, you can say, if you were to walk into Cambridge University or Bodleian Library and you see how people are busy reading books and producing researches, Spain was like that under the Muslim period. You know, there is no other comparison I can draw. I mean, Baghdad was like that as well, of course, at that time. One of the largest libraries in the world was in Baghdad, which was destroyed regretfully by the Mongols in 1258, when the entire library of Baghdad, of course, with the city of Baghdad, was completely burnt down or thrown into the river.
So, when the reconquest, the so-called reconquest, the Catholic armies, the Christian armies, perhaps due to disunity and division within the Islamic State, when that completed, Isabella and Ferdinand, I forget the name, Ferdinand, the king and the queen at that time, who were revered, I think, possibly as saints in the Catholic Church. When they reconquered, did they continue this tradition of working with Jews and Muslims in this high civilizational mode? How did they, or did they destroy that? What did they do to this wonderful civilization?
Reconquista started in the 11th century. You can say by the mid 11th century, Reconquista had already started, and it took another, let's say, 450 years for the Christians to take the rest of the Iberian Peninsula from Muslims. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't absolute. It took a while for the Catholics to take back the land from the Muslims. So initially, cities like Toledo, where Muslims had created a large, giant library. In fact, there were many libraries in the city of Toledo. City of Barbastro was taken in 1066. City of Toledo was taken in 1085. And then later on, fast forward in the 13th century, many more cities were taken. There was a battle in 1204 between the Almohads and Spanish kings, a coalition of Spanish kings who came from the north. That battle was lost, and as a result, many cities like Seville, Valencia, and Cordoba eventually, all three cities were lost within the 13th century. And what remained was the Nasrid dynasty in southern Spain, called Granada or Granata in the Arabic language. That remained, and then that dynasty survived for another 250 years. Initially, kings that came from the north taking all that territory. They were completely blown away by the civilization of Islam and Muslims in cities like Valencia, Seville, and Cordoba. They were completely blown away, and they were completely immersed within that civilization. And they, in fact, copied a lot of ideals and ideas at that time. They maintained tolerance initially. They followed the Muslim model. They had realized that one of the reasons why Islamic civilization in Spain was so successful was because of the coexistence Muslims had mastered. And that period is referred to by Spanish Arabists as La Convivencia or the Convivencia. Convivencia means coexistence, if we were to translate it into English. So that period is known as the period of coexistence, and the Christian monarchs initially followed that tradition. In fact, many of them adopted Muslim culture. They started to bathe, they started to dress like Muslims, they started to inscribe Arabic formulas inside their palaces. They started to use the decoration of the Muslims in the palace. They became completely Arabized, culturally speaking, not religiously, culturally speaking. But later on, unfortunately, things started to change, and many Jewish people and Muslim people faced heavy persecution. And by the 15th century and the 16th century, things had changed completely. It was in the 15th century, 1492 to be precise, a coalition of two states, Aragon and Castile. They invaded the last stronghold of Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula, and they took the state or the city of Granada after a long siege. And the Library of Granada, over 1 million books were burnt. They were destroyed. We don't know, only Allah knows what we lost there. Much of the Spanish legacy when it comes to literature and other educational contributions was lost in that particular destruction. And Ferdinand and Isabella were the monarchs who did this. And then after taking the city of Cordoba, sorry, not Cordoba, Granada, Christopher Columbus departed for looking, you know, he departed. I mean, he was funded by Ferdinand and Isabella. Not many people know this. He was actually funded by Ferdinand and Isabella. And this was a state venture. And Christopher Columbus bumped into America thinking it was India. Okay, so that's another story. And in fact, that story is directly linked to the decline of Islam in the Iberian Peninsula, right? It is directly linked. And in fact, it is believed that Christopher Columbus had Arabic cartographers and navigators helping him out. You know, so this is claimed. I don't know how true that is. I have read about it somewhere.
It would seem
so. So after Ferdinand and Isabella took Granada, they forcefully converted the Muslims and the Jewish people. Muslims became Moriscos, and the Jewish people became conversos. Right? These are the titles, or these are the names given to them. And I invite everyone, every viewer, to read on Moriscos, and you will be blown away by the amount of oppression.
Savagery.
And
absolutely. Had to prove themselves by eating pork, and Muslims had to prove themselves by drinking wine. I mean, it was appalling. It was difficult to exaggerate how appalling the persecution was in the name of Christianity, of course.
And you see, the Iberian Peninsula lost what it had created for the last 700 years, and this was a huge loss to that particular land or piece of land. And later on, what came with the Catholic monarchs, Muslims survived for another century until Philip III came to power in 1609. He banished all the Muslims. He had expelled all the Muslims, all remaining Muslims, albeit forcefully converted Muslims called Moriscos, to North Africa. Many of them died en route. Many of them remained behind. Many of them were sent to the Americas, and some found their way to North America. And some of those families can still be found in places like Morocco and Algeria. And the Jewish people, that's a completely another story. I mean, they were completely decimated. Many Jewish people were killed off. while they were on their way to the coast, and others were forcefully converted again, and very few made it to Ottoman lands, cities like Salonika, Jerusalem, and Constantinople. So there were neighborhoods as late as the 19th century in cities like Constantinople, Salonika, and Jerusalem, neighborhoods belonging to Jewish people who came from Spain, Spanish Jewry.
Yeah.
And they were known to be very civilized, very educated, very upright, very much prosperous. They had their own quarters, they had their own privileges, and they were seen to be very, very important people throughout the Ottoman period until the State of Israel was created.
Yeah, indeed, that changed the world as well. But coming back to the Spanish Inquisition, I've read part of its motivation and part of its objective was to sniff out these Jews, particularly, and Muslims too, who professed to be Catholic, who were forced to be Catholic, but who secretly held on to the belief in the oneness of God, for example, a key belief of Jews. The Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. We find that taught in the Quran as well, of course. And this was offensive to Christians, to Catholics who believe that God is three. And so the Inquisition sought to find these people and to root them out. And to, obviously, if they were discovered, they could be burnt at the stake horribly. So the persecution, it wasn't just formally. You really had to, they didn't want anyone who even pretended to be Catholic, that you had to be a real Catholic, and if you were a secret Jew, that was not acceptable. Even then, there was no tolerance, as we understand it, Islamically or in the modern sense.
Absolutely, absolutely. The Spanish Inquisition was one of the most, how can I put it, unpleasant episode in human history, whereby hundreds of thousands of people were brutalized, tortured in dungeons, forcefully converted, raped, cut to pieces, and burnt at stake, you name it. And the history is far too disturbing for me to discuss in a very short sitting like this. There are books written by scholars on Inquisition. One 19th century scholar produced a lot of work. His works, I mean, they haven't been entirely outdated, but there is a lot of information he collected. Henry Charles Lee. Lee is spelled with L-E-A. Henry Charles Lee has written not only a book on Moriscos, but he also wrote on the Spanish Inquisition extensively. And his books are very, very important. Also, if people want to read some modern works on Moriscos and what they went through, Moriscos were basically converted Muslims. Muslims who were forcefully converted to Islam, and they were in hundreds of thousands. People think there were a few thousand. No, they were in hundreds of thousands, and they were seen as a threat. In fact, some of the Catholic advisors to kings at that time, in particular, King Philip III, who decided to banish them, Catholics were worried about the growing population of the Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula or in Spain at that time. And some advisors thought that the Muslims will outnumber the Christians in Spain if they were not banished or stopped, right? The same fears that are being used today in Europe, demographic fears, where people are talking about increasing influence of Islam and increasing population.
Palestinians, of course, the increasing numbers of Palestinians, Arabs in what is called Israel is also a concern for Israelis. And just mentioning Israel there, but without going into all of that, but the history that you're describing are one of great tolerance and inclusiveness of Jewish populations, culture. The practice of the Torah is respected and permitted for many, many centuries. Gives the lie to the idea that Islam is anti-Jewish or anti-Judaism. No, it allows, formally, it has to, by command, it has to allow these groups to exist and flourish. And it's only with the, I would think, and the establishment of Zionist entity called Israel in Palestine, that suddenly this whole thing became very poisoned, very toxic. Relations were destroyed between Jews and Muslims. And this was a new thing, was it not, Adnan? A new thing in Muslim history. This wasn't like going back to, I don't know, the medieval period of Jewish-Muslim relations. This was an innovation, a bid'ah, if you like, in those relationships. And it's only almost in our lifetimes that we've seen this incredibly toxic, conflicted relationship between Jews and Christians. But it's to do with the political establishment of a Zionist structure on Muslim lands, the land of Palestine, of course.
Absolutely. You see, Muslims and Jews coexisted for almost 1,300 years. And it wouldn't be wrong to say that the Jews survived extinction due to the Muslim protection. This is not an exaggeration. Historically speaking, Jewish historians have confirmed this. Jacob Lasner is an American Jewish historian who has written a very, very good book on the Jewish experience under Islam. In fact, even some of the Zionist historians who are evidently hostile to Islam and things Islamic have confirmed this. People like Bernard Lewis, he wrote in his books that Muslims were treated far better than they were in Christian lands. Muslims are treated under Muslims far better than they were in Christian lands. This is Bernard Lewis speaking, who was seen as an authority in the history.
Bernard Lewis was a Jew himself, speaking about his own people and how they were treated in centuries past, much, much better than Jews were treated in the Christian world, in Christendom.
Absolutely, absolutely. And there are many, many more Jewish historians who have paid lavish tributes to the Muslim civilization and the protection the Jewish people received in general. In fact, some scholars even claim that the majority of the Jewish population in the world for over 1,000 years lived within the domains of Islam. So if Islam or the Muslim civilization had any anti-Semitic policy, it would have reflected in our history. It would have been evident in our history, which is not the case. What we do see is that the Jewish people flourishing throughout the Muslim civilization from Spain to China. In fact, there are periods when the Jewish people became highly successful in business, in producing literature, in educating people, in occupations like medicine, for example. Some of the top physicians in the Muslim world were Jewish. Some of the top authors and poets were Jewish. Okay, some of the advisors to Muslim sultans were Jewish, military advisors. Okay, so the Jewish people, they flourished, they enjoyed their life under the House of Islam. In fact, one of the Jewish scholars called Amnon Cohen has produced a 2-volume work titled A Word from Within, and he studied the court records of the city of Jerusalem from the year 1500 to 1570. This was the Ottoman period when Sultan Suleiman, the Ottoman Sultan, was ruling this territory. During the Ottoman period, Amnon Cohen argues that the Jewish people were filing cases within the Islamic court. They were coming to the Muslim court, even though they had Beth Dins, their own rabbinic courts within the city of Jerusalem, whereby they had the autonomy to govern their own societies with their own law. They were applying with the Islamic court to get justice. And this was happening because they would get justice quicker within the Islamic court than they would within their own courts. And in his conclusion, he states that the Jewish people had nothing to complain about throughout this period. So from 1500 to 1570, what he has seen in this period is prosperity, coexistence, tolerance for the Jewish people, even freedom to apply within the Muslim courts. You know, they could come to the Muslim courts and apply for justice. And cases varied from provisions when there is a dispute between husband and wife, and the husband refuses to provide for the family. Jewish women were applying with the Muslim courts for justice, and justice was given. It was delivered. So Amnon Cohen, having studied these records, he concluded that the Jewish people were very prosperous, very happy, and they had nothing to complain about living under the Ottoman sultans.
So something, I'm not going to go into the Palestinian-Israeli conflict here because it's a totally different subject, but
Absolutely.
Clearly something catastrophic happened in the history of Islam in 1,300 years to change all this so dramatically and seemingly finally. Some of it happened in the 20th century, of course. And we're not going to go into that. People know what it's about. So, but I just wanted to stress this because of how totally uncharacteristic. This there is anti-Semitism amongst Muslims. I've seen it. I've seen it at Speaker's Corner, particularly after you get an atrocity or an attack. And I've seen some stuff which, you know, can come out of Germany in the 30s. And you know, I mean, not many people, but I've heard it from Muslims' lips, and it's shocking. And of course, to European ears, it sounds very shocking. But historically, this has got to be put into a context. This is a very recent development triggered by appalling events in the Middle East, which we all know about. We see it all the time. We must remember that. And now, unfortunately, Islam has become stained in people's eyes, some people's eyes, with an anti-Semitic trope. But that's not just given everything you said, Adnan, about Islamic history and the Quran and everything else. So it's very, very sad, very, very sad. That's all I can say.
Absolutely. And what you need to think about is that hostility comes from both sides. There are Zionist propagandists who are claiming a very bad experience of the Jewish people with Islam and Muslims. And on the other hand, there are anti-Semitic Muslims who are making statements that are outrightly anti-Jewish. And both of these realities do not reflect, are not reflected in the history of Islam. Both of these realities, the Muslim anti-Semitism is something new. Where it does exist, it is something new. And Zionist hostility or basically distortion of Muslim history is also something new. Dean Philip Bell, who is a historian of the Jewish people, also wrote in his book, I forgot the title of his book, he wrote that the Jewish Golden Age, the notion of the Jewish Golden Age under Islam was never really questioned until the State of Israel was created. Oh. It was only then when the notion of the Jewish Golden Age under Islam was questioned by Zionist propagandists and historians, right? So this phenomenon, the Muslim anti-Semitism, albeit in a very minor segment of the Muslim community, is something new. This is entirely caused by the recent unfortunate events in Israel. And since the creation of the State of Israel, this relationship between the Jewish people and the Muslim civilization in general has become bitter. And there are many, many ill feelings, unfortunately, caused by this extremist ideology, which was forged by the Jewish anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism against Jewish people in the 19th century. So unfortunately, for some reason, the Palestinians were punished for European anti-Semitism. This is another,
And there's a nasty twist now, this is going off the subject a bit, but where anti-Semitism, real anti-Semitism is, in Britain anyway, is deliberately conflated with being pro-Palestinian and anti-Zionist. So it's becoming very difficult now to speak publicly of criticizing the politics of the State of Israel as a state without being accused of this heinous sin of anti-Semitism. So effectively, there is a shutting down of freedom of speech to speak out in terms of justice for an oppressed group. Oppressed groups on all sides, particularly the Palestinians. So it's getting worse. The screws are turning. Now to even say these things has been labeled as anti-Semitism, which is a great sin in the eyes in the West, and actually criminalized, and you can be censored, lose your job. We've seen what's happened to the Labour Party, the former leader of the Labour Party, who was ludicrously and ridiculously accused of anti-Semitism. He spent his whole life campaigning against racism, his whole life, and yet he was accused of this because he was pro-Palestinian. And the way these two now have very cleverly been fused together, it's a very clever maneuver. But this is a different subject, but I just despair sometimes.
Absolutely, and there are two things people need to remember from Islam when it comes to dealing with non-Muslims in general, not only the Jewish people. This is a general verse in the Quran in chapter 60, verse 8, where God Almighty stated that God does not forbid you from being kind to those who do not fight you for your religion and do not drive you out of your homes. Be just, be kind to them. So this is chapter 60, verse 8, where there is a general rule when it comes to dealing with non-Muslims. Those who do not fight you, do not drive you out, do not brutalize you, do not kill you, do not persecute you, you are to be kind to them. This is a general rule stipulated within the Quran. also when it comes to the Jewish people in particular, Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he had a treaty with the Jewish people of Medina, one of the clauses in the treaty, actually the conclusion of the treaty, states that the Muslims are to extend a sympathetic treatment towards the Jewish people. Okay, this is clearly stipulated in the Treaty of Medina, which was documented, or which was basically put down.
We still have this treaty, don't we? It's extant.
Absolutely.
We can,
Absolutely.
people can. I've read this. I know Wikipedia is a dodgy source sometimes, but I have read an article on Wikipedia on the Treaty of Medina, or the Constitution of Medina, as it's called, also, and people can read this for themselves, and many other extraordinarily modern, in a way, protections for religious freedom and the rights of people who are not Muslims in this nascent state in Medina. It's quite extraordinary, I think.
You see, one confusion can arise, Paul, from reading the Quran. A lot of people see a lot of criticism of the House of Israel in the Quran and some of the practices. So what they do is they jump straight to a wrong conclusion, claiming that the Quran is essentially or intrinsically anti-Semitic, which is not the case. The Quran criticizes Christian beliefs. Quran criticizes Jewish beliefs. Quran criticizes pagan beliefs. So the Quran is a book that was revealed to reveal the truth. And when truth is revealed, of course, falsehood in the eyes of God, as we the Muslims believe, has to be highlighted. So as far as the Muslims are concerned, the Jewish religion, the Christian religion, and other ideas that have been criticized in the Quran are simply false. You know, they are not true ways to God. And that's very, very, very categorically stated in the Quran. Now, that does not mean that you start to persecute the Christians and the Jews and other non-Muslims, because for that, rules have been stipulated again within the Quran, making it very clear that you cannot compel them to accept Islam. You are to treat them kindly, even though they are different, they believe in different things. You are to treat them as the people of the book, in particular the Jewish and the Christian people. They are given the title Ahlul Kitab, the people of the book. In fact, you can even marry from the people of the book, right? How can you marry someone you are to hate? This is, I mean, a lot of people erroneously ask me this question: can we be friends with the Jews and the Christians? And I ask them, can you marry an enemy? Can you get married to your enemy? Is that possible? Would you marry your enemy? And they say no. So how can you have a wife in your house who is a Jew or a Christian and not have a relationship with her? Okay, not be friendly towards her, not even, you know, okay. Absolutely. So this is something people, you know, these are the nuances people overlook very often when they're talking about Islam and Judaism and Christianity and, you know, exchanging of ideas between these three Abrahamic faiths.
What I find interesting, this is going off a subject, and I won't pursue this subject because we're perhaps drawing to a close now, but is when I read the New Testament, let alone the Old Testament, that there is no sense in the New Testament documents, who were never designed to address these questions anyway, of, well, how do we coexist in an ongoing society? How do we relate to non-Christians? So what rights do they have, or responsibilities, and so on? This doesn't exist in the New Testament at all. Now, my own view is it's because many of the authors thought the world was going to end pretty quickly. Paul certainly did in various letters. The end's coming, basically. So you're not going to be thinking in terms of how do we build a just society where people's responsibilities and rights are acknowledged. But Islam, as sees itself as the last testament rather than the New Testament, the last one, obviously has thought about these questions and come to an understanding about how to keep going through the generations, through history, in a way that the Bible doesn't do, interestingly enough. And so in the Catholic Church, they had to develop new understandings, new ideas through Augustine and Aquinas and so on, to add on what was not there. But it's there in the beginning with Islam. And I think that's one of the differences between Christianity in its origins and Islam in its origins. Islam was fully matured from the beginning, whereas Christianity was very embryonic and took many, many centuries to become a civilization, Christendom, which did have these elements in it. Anyway, it's just my view.
You see, Paul, what you said is absolutely right. there are no clear instructions on how to treat the other in the New Testament. And you know what was the outcome, the result of that? The result of that was confusion for 2,000 years and people making things up as they went along. Some societies persecuted the Jewish people, some did not. And if it wasn't for Augustine writing in the 4th century, if it wasn't for Augustine writing what he wrote about the Jewish people, he basically wrote that Jewish people are to left, you know, they are to survive, they have to survive as a sign for the truth of the Lord, right? Yeah. As witnesses to the truth of the Lord and to the Old Testament. So for that reason, if Augustine did not write what he wrote, I think Jewish people would have been extinct a long time ago within the Christian lands or Christendom, right? So that confusion or that lack of information in the New Testament impacted the Jewish people directly, and their experience throughout Christendom was very, very unfortunate, very disturbing and unpleasant. And then comes along Islam, and Jewish people found refuge with the Muslims. Hence, the majority of the Jewish population found safe havens within the Muslim lands. That's why they moved in large numbers. The diaspora, the Jewish diaspora, only continued because of Muslim protection. Otherwise, there would be no Jewish diaspora post 6th, 7th century. I don't think so. Right?
In my home in London, in Maida Vale, in Westminster, I'm not there now, but in Maida Vale, there's a Sephardic synagogue explicitly says for Portuguese and Spanish Jews, and it's been there for a very long time. But the very existence of that small and very influential community in that part of London is a direct tribute to the way that they were welcomed and given space to exist and flourish in the Islamic world, which they didn't have in England. Obviously, I forget which king it was, but King John II or something, he expelled the Jews from England.
Edward I. That was Edward I.
Edward I, beg your pardon. And it was only many centuries later under Cromwell. Anyway, that's a different story. But so it impacts even Maida Vale in London. This historical reality you speak of. It might be an idea to draw it to. I mean, I could carry on for hours, but we don't want to tire everyone and Adnan out. But perhaps good idea to draw it to a close. And maybe Adnan, if you in the future you were to come back and discuss this further, you'd be most welcome. But can I just thank you, Adnan, for your gracious time answering these questions and really explaining in a very clear way, which is what I wanted to hear, the real history of Islam, as opposed to the false history, which even my friend across the road here in France is still learning, it seems, in French schools, at least in this part of France, about Islam going out with the sword and forcing people to convert. I mean, goodness knows what's going on here in France. Is there anything you want to say in conclusion, Adnan, before we close?
I would like to thank you for inviting me to address these important questions, very, very important questions. I don't think we have addressed these questions in such detail before. Of course, there are far more details you can find in books we have mentioned, and there are many, many more books. Perhaps we can put up a list later on at another stage, inshallah, and provide reading lists for our listeners and viewers. Excellent. So that they can read more on these topics. So other than that, thank you so much for your time, for your invitation. I am honored to be on your blog, and I look forward to another one of these. Thank you.
Well, that's great. And as I say, that's a great idea, Adnan, at the end then about a reading list, actually, because I know a lot of viewers, myself included, are interested in pursuing this and going beyond the superficialities of social media into some actual scholarly research, which we can all do these days. We have access to these books. So that's great. Well, thank you again. Thank you very much, Adnan Rashid. And until next time, thank you.
Thank you.